Hey folks, and welcome to the Outperformer webinar. Today on the topic of transitioning from finance leadership to the General Manager or the Managing Director role. Just for some context, I'm Pete Smith. I'm one of Outperformer's lead facilitators on the co-design programs that we produce for finance leaders and their teams. I'll be hosting today's session as unfortunately Brad Eisenhuth is at a good friend's funeral. So for anyone who's new to the Outperformer, these webinars are run regularly so you can learn and hear about strategies adopted by leaders in our field. CFOs, executives, subject matter experts, all dedicated to helping and giving back to the accounting and finance community. There's opportunity to ask questions as we go through the day. We should be here for about 40-45 minutes. So today's topic is about a talented finance leader who has a passion for business, making a natural transition from finance director tag to managing director of Lebara, building a career with some high profile and complex organisations such as the Yum brand restaurants, Qantas and Asciano. Our guest today has developed a wealth of knowledge and stories that are pretty valuable for any aspiring leader navigating their way through the opportunities and challenges in their career. So today we really want to focus on exploring moving from that finance CFO to the MD role, what changed, and what stays the same, and just really getting a handle on career purpose, like who is this person behind this journey and why are they on this part of their career, and the importance of emotional intelligence in business and in your personal life in a pretty busy career that we're all involved in. So I'm going to get going and introduce Ash. Ash, thanks for taking the time to join the community today.
Pleasure, Pete.
To get some context, it feels like a bit like, what was that show? It used to be called This Is Your Life, and they trot out all of the little memorabilia and the photos and everything like that. But I understand it started for you in high school when you pretty much looked in the Sydney Morning Herald under A at jobs. So take us from there, in a truncated version.
Yeah, look, Pete, thanks very much. And it's a very unremarkable story, but I think after school I realised I had to do something. And I think in terms of my next move, had a few careers in mind. Engineering was probably up there, but I think I picked up the Sydney Morning Herald pages in those days before the internet and started at A and, found a lot of these accounting cadetships in audit firms, which meant you got money in your pocket and you can move through that.
Need to be CPA or anything?
No. So it was designed for basically finishing high school, starting university, and for me it was a chance to, I just chucked my hat in the ring, see what happened, and lo and behold, I was being interviewed and got a role.
Yeah, right. And in the early days, what was the sort of exciting thing about the industry back then? Like, tell us, were you still using abacus? That's my
We were
ignorance.
I think it's a pretty digital age, so I think for us in those days there was only, one computer for 5 staff. We were definitely using green pens. It was a different era, so I think I got the sense of it, and we had a few audit clients that were even using Kalamazoo and manual account keeping rather than even using computers. I'm talking about some major...
Yeah, so there's big ledger books.
Correct,
keep everything going.
Yep.
Right. And in terms of your role now, tell me about the arc of learning from there to here. What was the sort of stages of your journey in your career?
So in terms of my brief CV from that point of view, I started off in audit and was exposed to Westfields, I think, and then I made the move in 1998 to Goodman Fielder, so I moved from audit into commercial.
Yeah, right, and pretty heavy going commercial in terms of FMCG.
FMCG, international area, definitely I thought the transition would be easy, but it was pretty challenging. Yeah. And I'd completed my university at Macquarie University that stage, and then I'd started my chartered accounting qualification, so I was part way through that as I moved over, and then as I concluded that, I did what all people at that time and probably still do, as I headed off to the UK. And for the experience, for the visa, it's a bit wobbly with the whole working holiday things. I don't have ancestry or anything, but nevertheless, got a role there. I was there for about a year with Barclays Bank. So I moved into the financial services, and it was all around a recruiter who said, you come to London, Ash, he says, you can further your career, but you'll end up in zone 6. You want to be part of the London experience, you have to think differently. And so, so look, one thing followed another, and it was sounds more deliberate than probably what it was, but that's how it panned out. And then upon returning to Australia in 2001, I then had a role at Yum Restaurants in financial control, looking after the accounting for KFC and Pizza Hut and managing some transactions.
Discounts when you went native?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And I am a bit of a fast food junkie, so I don't have a lot of discipline in that space. Yeah, so definitely was a good and bad thing. And then my next move after that in 2006, what I think we may have crossed over, Pete, was when I worked at Qantas Engineering.
Yeah, right, terrific.
So
pretty challenging times there for the airline industry, a lot of outsourcing and stuff.
A lot of outsourcing. I think Jetstar was sort of just starting to hit its straps and take on more. I think fuel prices had gone through the roof, and Qantas was looking at a way to unleash value in the organisation. And I hear it was I think almost the second biggest employer of accountants outside of Macquarie Bank in industry. Wow. So I managed to mix with a lot of amazing, talented people, some of which I'll still keep in touch with today.
Yeah, fantastic. I always remember this saying, something like, what is most general is most specific, or be a generalist first, and then sort of specialise. So tell me how being a generalist, as it sounds from that, really helped you to specialise.
In many ways, I probably did the reverse. So I specialised before I generalised. So what I mean that in terms of my sphere of accounting, industry-wise, you're right. So when you put that lens over it, I definitely have played in a lot of industries from that point. Obviously, subsequent to Qantas was in logistics and ports and containers, and then now I'm in telecommunications. So I think if finance is a universal kind of discipline, so I think it lends itself to moving towards industries, but I probably have moved around a lot than I'd realised in hindsight. But for me, that was just a natural path. So to answer your question, I think it's probably once you can accomplish some elements of finance, and we can't be all facets of it. For example, tax is definitely a weakness in my skill set. It then lends itself towards different industries and adapting some of those principles.
Yeah, right. And is that how you fell into telco? I don't want to say fell into. Was it a strategic move?
No, it most certainly was not a strategic move. It was one of when I'd finished at Asciano, the role was no longer existed, and there was any other opportunities that were outside of Sydney, and I wanted to stay in Sydney. So when that came up, I was looking around, and the attraction to Lebara was basically there was some people that who were telecommunications veterans and quite well known in the sector, and it was an opportunity to work with some talented people around that. So it wasn't something that I was targeted. It was basically go have a coffee with the guys, see what you think. I clicked, and I was intending to stay for a couple of years as a stepping stone, because for me it was moving from a specialist to a financial leader, so a head of finance director type role. And then the next phase for me would then to be looking at some sort of financial leadership role in a multinational where I normally have resided prior to that. So that's where I probably went a little bit off script. Okay. So I'm still there 7 years later, and we'll talk a bit about that.
Yeah, no. So it's a terrific transition that one can make. Tell me a bit about your role now in Lebara.
Yeah, so I've grown a lot. So effectively, I'm the general manager for Lebara. We're owned by Vodafone since 2016, and prior to acquisition, I was the managing director, first in an acting capacity and then through the sale. That basically means I'm in charge of the full business unit in terms of sales and marketing, distribution, operations, customer management, customer service, obviously finance, strategy, HR, risk, IT, so the whole lot. So
I'll come back to that because I don't think you've had training in that, or at least you've been exposed to it.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, right. And so, I'm always interested when people find themselves in a role like this, like how they've moved away, and certainly for our finance community, wanting to make that leap, wanting to kind of run a business one day. What are sort of 2 or 3 key skills that you've had to focus on more to take that transition to understand sales and marketing and running a business unit? What are the skills you really had to build on? Yeah,
well, that's I think you've emphasised it quite well, and it's a good call out. So essentially, not being trained in sales and marketing is obviously something I need to obviously be aware of in that way. So in the early days when I was in finance, I always tried to be commercial. So in terms of answering your question, I'll roll it into there. So I think I've always tried to partner with sales and marketing and try to learn. So I think even coming from finance, just understanding the objectives of either short-term campaigns, budget cycles or longer term strategies.
Right.
It's always try to understand what they're trying to achieve. What does success really look like?
For them.
For
So
them.
getting in their shoes, understanding their goals, and then kind of not looking at it through a finance lens,
Correct.
but looking back at finance through their lens.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And once you ascribe what they are trying to achieve, you'll find that you'll come across some talented people. So I think in the early days, the sales director of our organisation had a very unique talent of obviously being good at selling and motivating their team, but equally interfacing well with the management team and being able to provide very mature insights and driving, I suppose, realistic objectives. So that's a very delicate balance, I think, to facilitate.
Now, are these the coffees that you talked about? You would be really strategic about who you want to sort of connect with to understand more of how they do.
Well, we're relatively small, so from that point of view, you really have to build relationships with everyone internally in your business, and then we were managed from a head office in London, so through a management structure, and then we were built up. I mean, our organisation turned over $1 billion operating across countries in Europe and Australia, Australia being a relatively small component of that business, but nevertheless we would still have exposure to the founders and the owners of the business as well as the C-suite, which were based in London. So with all those things in mind, it was very important to sort of build those cross relationships and to sort of mark your territory and to often speak up and drive what was important. So I've tried to also instill values, things like being transparent, earning trust, making commitments, and basically saying, look, if the team believed in something and it was predicated on a fairly ambitious assumption for a business case, I'd certainly flag it out, but then I wouldn't hesitate in putting my own view forward, much as a passive investor would, and say, look, for what it's worth, I think this, and then obviously the audience may or may not decide that that's important to them, but I would always put my own view on it.
Right, and you're doing that, and to me it makes sense. You're being a non-financial kind of guy. I kind of think I like to know the guy that's got his finger on the pulse of the numbers is going to have a pretty important opinion.
Yep.
And so you're saying that as a finance professional, we need to be really sort of stepping out with that in a way that it's not kind of, because sometimes I see it's almost like you beat them over the head with your numbers, but it's rather, is it about framing it in their language? Or
it is, and it's more about trying to connect with them first, so finding out what the initiatives are. So for example, we might launch a new product. So it's trying to work out, well, what is the impact of that product going to be? So is it going to have a cannibalisation effect on the existing product suite? What are the new distribution opportunities it has? What are the competitive dynamics? So generally you'll find all the key data points are in the room, and it's a matter of just trying to get them, distill through those types of issues. And I think as a finance person, we're able to sort of almost be able to almost cross-reference those pieces of information and then try to see if we can get some calibrate the elements, but also then be able to just vet and endorse what everyone's thinking and seeing where it is. So there is obviously the teamwork involved, but at the end of the day you have to form a view. So I think once we all tend to land on a similar piece of set of information, and that may be quite ambiguous, but it nevertheless is something we're all looking at, then it's about then trying to align against that data set and information to make informed decisions as best as we can. A lot of it, in fact, is gut feel.
That was literally what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Every now and then you've kind of got as much data as you can get in front of you.
Yeah.
And then you're really hoping and the trust from the colleagues and the senior managers in you and you in them.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, we've got it all here in front of us. What are we going to do?
Yeah. And there's two elements to that. One is about your colleagues and yourself saying, look, do we back ourselves? Do we think we can become successful? Do you think if we do all these things, if we get what we're asking for, if we need some investment, like we need some OPEX or we need some capital expenditure, or we need to build something new, will it come off? And second of all is to read the appetite of our investors or our senior management to say, look, are they really up for this? So, do they understand what success looks like? Do they understand what failure looks like? And if that's the case, what plans do we have to mitigate those situations? So I think with finance, the one thing we're grounded on, whilst we're not sales and marketers, we are probably seeing the first indicators of things, whether they're successful or unsuccessful. In other words, is it viable for the business? Yeah,
and that's where you're putting your real business hat on, aren't you? And so to that end, I mean, I hope this isn't come across as a cheeky question, but
No.
why you? Why did they bring you on as the MD? It's kind of you're the finance guy up on the 5th floor.
Yeah.
How does that bridge get built?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting life. Often has twists and turns that you can never anticipate. But look, I suppose part of it's being in the right place at the right time, and being there. So look, the business had some changes through a process, and we were going through a contract negotiation. So Lebara is a prepaid mobile provider, and we use Vodafone.
Right.
There was a parallel renegotiation of our contract because it was up for renewal. And during that time, there was some staff changes that were there. And I was initially in an acting capacity in terms of leading the business.
Okay, so it was a lucky stroke to get you in there.
Yeah. And there was also a search commenced for somebody to run the business as the managing director. I had expressed an interest, and one of the founders of the business, who I respect very much, had not thought of me as being suitable nor in the mix for that kind of position, and wanted. Had something in mind effectively. What that was obviously what wasn't me. So I accepted that position where it was, but in the meantime I had the opportunity to manage the business on at an interim level. So during that period, as we were then going through a contract renewal, the business was also being, other options were being explored, like a sale, and eventually we did get sold to Vodafone, and that was about a similar time frame.
But
so
I bet you were given it a red hot crack.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we needed to do is we needed to show a few things. So I think what was we around showing, some alignment and things, but then they don't affect the numbers on a piece of paper. At the end of the day, you're selling a business, it's like a home, you want to get the most for it. The actions behind it are to get the result, and the result we were hoping to achieve was certain sales targets and distribution targets. So it was a very different change of tempo. So I think in the meantime, I was given a fortunate thing, and I think I just adopt a philosophy. I have an appetite for risk, I think, and essentially I took an approach of either crash or crash through. There was no halfway house about this.
You kind of want to.
Yeah, so we went to the biggest resellers in the market, which was Coles or Woolworths, and I was fortunate to do some quick deals, and we were able to get some promotions to drive our sales and our brand, and I think we were able to hit the targets that we needed to. In the meantime, the sale of the business or the purchase of it by Vodafone was getting more serious, and I think at that stage the search for a managing director from external sources or from somewhere else in another part of the organisation had stopped.
I kind of want to give you a high five on that one. Well done.
Yeah, so I think it was just, look, you got the chance, you don't get these chances. So I think in hindsight, maybe I was busy with it all because it was pretty stressful from working through all those things. But I think, the takeaway I make is that, if you got it, you may as well make the most of it. The worst you can do is go back to what you were doing before. Yeah,
that's it. So tell me about how you come to have a plan around this, because I'm sure you didn't just you might have made a lot of it up as you went along.
Yep.
But tell me, how were you thinking strategically? What was in your peripheral vision?
Well, I think all good ideas in business and driving things are usually within your people. So we have talented people within the functional areas like sales and marketing and operations and so on. And it's worth remembering that in finance, I had my financial controller. He took a ride with me as well, and he's now head of operations. So.
Right.
So he was sort of my right-hand man in a way, and able to work things together. So I had the luxury of being able to test ideas amongst the team, having some good, rigorous dialogue at the management level and working through some of those issues, but then going to market very quickly, trying things out. We're an agile brand, and then having a plan B in case it doesn't quite materialise the way we hope it would, or make tweaks and adjustments. So I think from that point of view, it really taught me about execution and really taught me about trying to empower and get the team to do as much of it as it can. My own philosophy is not to become a hub in business, but to have individuals who manage functions, and they're very senior, talented staff who could have equally have taken my role as well, to work together. So using the best of the best to try to drive a common outcome for everyone.
So you really, this peripheral vision that you've got, and you mentioned it before about finding the folks who really know their stuff, and partnering with them in a way that they're going to kind of, the team is going to work together. And to me, that sounds like a pretty strong why for you. How the team comes together. Tell me more about that.
So I think in terms of the way team comes together, look, there were some gaps in terms of skills. So I think when we got pushed over to Vodafone and we got purchased by them, they were very enthusiastic about the acquisition, and they were very excited about the team and bringing on the business. And philosophically, they weren't looking to create a mini Vodafone. They were looking to have it as another brand in their stable, but to maintain its autonomy to the point where we have different premises, we run our own brand, and we have different governance structures when we need to execute as well. So we didn't want it to become a mini Vodafone. So with those things in mind, and particularly for my skill set, we had made a lot of changes which I'd engineered around marketing and sales. So marketing, we significantly increased the headcount, and we created specialisations for things like digital, and also for I'm trying to get more strategic. So we'd also then tapped into things like the Roy Morgan household survey, and we're able to explore what our brand had meant, why we got to where we got to, and understanding, say, marketing media that we're looking at. And then on the sales side, beefing up our sales distribution to try to cover, we've got over 10,000 points in Australia. It's a very large landmass, and it's very, very huge challenge that even the large companies face to how to distribute to that large footprint. Creating strategic partnerships, which we were able to do, and we're able to leverage off some relationships that Vodafone has actually with many of these distributors. So effectively getting back to basics around those areas, but really partnering with experts, both internally that we brought into the business or people from the business we promoted, and also having a big focus on those areas, and then basically aligning that to our finance and strategy functions already.
This is really interesting. The thing that's occurring for me, if I was a finance professional, and the only example I'm thinking of is like when I'm coaching someone, I'm mindful of the problem they're trying to solve in that coaching session, but then I'm always thinking about, well, what's the output of their role, and then what effect does that have on someone and the output of their role? So it sounds like you really thought about the extension of the business out into the market, out into not just here's my finance function and here's how it has effect on sales, marketing, and everything like that. You actually thought, what's the effect of that on sales and marketing outside the business, and even the brand, by the sound of it too.
Yeah, and I think it's all been about the customer. So, I've worked in large organisations, and particularly retail, it's all about the customer. And particularly as a smaller brand in prepaid, our customers make a buying decision every 30 days. So we don't have postpaid contracts at this stage of our journey. So for that reason, we need to be on top of our game, and we need to be treating the customer with the utmost respect and giving them a very positive experience. Finance guys aren't, finance communities, that's not what we are there to do. Traditionally is our function, our contribution to the business. But obviously the marketing function and operations, because they manage the call centres, and also our sales function, are very invested and very, very swayed by what happens with the customer. So that was something about then trying to champion what the customer needs. But being a retail product, I think the learning curve is quite easy and palatable.
Isn't it?
We all know how to use a mobile phone. We know how to manage an account. So often the flaws of not being an insider in the business can often be strengths, because our customers don't invest all that time to know every nuance and understand the whole suite of differences between competitors. They basically invest time that they see fit, and that's the perception they form of your brand. So that's often a way that I look at
when they make those choices. It's the epitome of customer centricity. So then what is, someone in finance, what's their customer centricity have to be about? Like, where do you think the thinking needs to be?
So I think in terms of finance, it's about trying to be supportive of the function. So you can't obviously greenlight everything. There are going to be initiatives that are challenging.
And that's what people push back on.
Yeah, and I found this out in my early days. So I think I matured when I was in finance, as a finance director of the business, pulling it all together. I was in there for 5 years, and certainly when I started the role to when I finished the role, at the beginning it was very black and white. Oh, this doesn't work, you can't do this, you can't do that. And then I thought, it's not really adding much value to the business. And in fact, that was the feedback I was receiving from the business, is that you need to be giving some more insight into why this isn't happening and what's not happening. And often if you come across as too negative, then you also suffer from becoming irrelevant, and other areas will try to work around you or go above you and so on. So I think, long story short, it's about trying to interface and much like the appetite to learn how to drive customer sales or customer experience or distribution strategies, equally to be open and transparent with financials, the financial side. So I think in terms of, I think everybody understands when you get all the inputs and feed it through the sausage machine, they may not know what happens in the sausage machine, but they understand what comes out the other side. So I think it's just being transparent around that side of it and saying, look, if we're able to increase customer lifetime, for example, you know, from this particular acquisition, maybe a customer that may stay with us for 8 months, if we can lift that to 12 or 13 months, that moves the dial a bit, because by that stage we've got some more margin to play with, and that then moves the conversation along.
Yeah, it is really interesting. So the real skills I'm picking up on there that one would need to employ, it's almost like being curious, being inquisitive, like getting in there and
yes,
really
it is.
putting your nose to the grindstone. Okay. Now, again, we're in that, you know, this is your life show, and I get that feeling like, you know, we've brought out some special edition of some chapter of your life or whatever. And
sure.
You know, I know some challenges I face when I'm getting up and speaking in front of people is, you know, remembering the story that I want to tell. But, you know, are there times in your career, good or bad, where you think you've set yourself up well for the future? You know, that could be good and bad. I've learned the worst from when I've failed. So share a bit more about your personal story where you've really, you know, come out strong.
Yeah, well, I think I realise I'm not in an interview situation, so
you got the job.
I'm going to go with the bold one, and I'm just saying I'm going to go with the bad. So I think, you know, obviously now being in the workforce for over, you know, 23, 24 years, it's something that I've learnt a lot from. So one of the areas I've been, I probably was not aware in the early days, is that I definitely had a blind spot in terms of perceived loyalty to both my function and possibly the organisation. And that loyalty, as I understand it, as I've tried to distill into what the issues are, has been around not necessarily paying enough attention to what key stakeholders want. Now,
really narrow in
bit narrow and very much focused on the result. And where the blind spot essentially was that understanding again the appetite of stakeholders and where they want it to go, and understanding that it's about obviously senior staff or the organisation setting its key priorities around that. So often if there's a conflict there, that's where I think the idea of disloyalty can sort of face itself. And I think I found myself in one particularly difficult situation whereby I felt there had been an injustice served in a sense that I'd been doing some good things for the organisation, in my opinion. That doesn't necessarily mean that I was, but I hadn't brought my colleagues along, my peers or my managers or any of the senior management. They weren't along for the ride at the end. So the specifics of that particular situation were that I worked in a team which was quite obviously trying to add value to the business. And this particular business, we were looking at some cost lines and found some savings. We were overpaying on some utility type costs. And through one of those areas, we found there was possibly some revenue type initiatives that could be initiated, and they were around things like accepting more payment types, and again somehow getting customers, reducing the friction from buying the product at that level. So talking very broadly, but essentially focusing more on the internal dynamics. So initially we worked quite strongly on those. I worked closely with the bank through a transactional relationship. It effectively led to a lot of interest in the industry, and I was invited to a lot of national merchant forums, not necessarily with finance staff, but with representatives of fairly large organisations who also have decent retail bases, and working through initiatives of how to reduce things like fraud, but at the same time try to grow revenue through accepting different payment types. And it was basically driving that next stage. So I'd got a lot of confidence through that process. I'd won some internal awards from the CFO and even the Chief Legal Officer for saving money, and some good initiatives. But where it really sort of came unravelled for me was, it was going all well at this stage, but where it unravelled a bit was when I brought it back to the business around some of the initiatives. I hadn't spent sufficient amount of time or effort, or even tried to gauge whether this is where the business felt it wanted to go. So I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't bring any, didn't test the ideas around, presented it, as being a solution. In my own mind, I felt it was very beneficial, but I think what actually materialised was probably doubt, and probably others weren't convinced of where it was.
Right.
Meantime, my own manager had moved on into a different role and gone to work for somebody else. And I think, long story short, I persevered, rightly or wrongly, I persevered. And in what happened in hindsight, I suppose the dynamics of it in terms of my own contribution, it just became worse.
Yeah.
So things that I was doing routinely, which I was lapping up in terms of financial reporting, financial control, I found myself suddenly getting questioned through those, a source of irritation and so on. About that, and potentially being distracted with my core duties. So I think from that I learned, and probably many years later learned, that was something which was probably due to the blind spot I mentioned before.
That's it.
So the organisation, it was doing very well.
Yeah,
It was growing, double digit every year. Its bottom line was growing. It was doing well. It's probably beating its budgets at the time and going from that. So why push it further and so on? And I'd failed to probably garnish perspectives from other sources around possibly some other risks to the business that could have jeopardised some robust revenue streams or profit outcomes. So.
In this day and age, that kind of, that's the foundation of what's happening in so many industries, the disruption that comes out of left field. If the rest of the business doesn't know what you're up to, that can really tailgate your best efforts.
So for me, it was a bit like, I think I am a curious mind, and it was a little bit of, it had developed a momentum of its own, and part of that curiosity was to see it out to almost where it was. But it got to the point where then I felt my role became untenable, and from that point, I'd sort of taken it away. But on reflection, it's those very same skills that have now been somewhat tempered and I suppose reframed about trying to get the awareness around how I interact with others that I think have now assisted me in making that transition from finance to general management.
And do you think that's the biggest challenge that folks face, is being able to kind of put aside that, I want to call it confirmation bias?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how they need to, tell me more about this curiosity thing. What do they need to really nut out and get to the bottom of?
Well, I think when you start looking at, even as a finance person, when you start looking at a set of numbers and if you want to pitch something back to the business, and you'll generally get a chance. So you might get a day where you have an off-site and someone from the leadership team will drop by or something. I mean, I'm not saying to be calculated that way too. I've never been that way too, but in hindsight, that's what I would suggest. So you go through the numbers, have a look at the dynamics in the relationships, don't follow the status quo, see what's driving it behind there, and then have a look potentially what used to work many years ago, or what people say. There will always be someone in your business who's always reminiscing the good old days when things worked a lot easier, but try to understand what that's about, and then see where the key driver of where is the contribution of your revenue to the business. So for example, in my business 5 or 6 years ago, we were getting all of our money from international calling. But that's now moved towards things like, FaceTime, Skype, and a lot of plans are now just throwing in minutes overseas, and people may have been paying $30, $40 to call overseas, and some are now paying nothing. So how are we sustainable? What's made it? At the end of the day, it's been the uptake of data. Data is a new drug in telco, and essentially people want data. They can't have enough of it, and most people, we think, have got a certain budget in mind, and will try to get as much data as they can for that value, and they'll trade those things off against things like network and so on and so forth. But that's how we've been able to monetize. So effectively, our profit pool from 5 or 6 years ago is fundamentally different to where we are today. And then working through what that will look like in say 4 or 5 years' time from now is our next challenge. And they're the specifics of my industry, but I think I'm sure other industries are disrupted and have those fundamental changes like we've had.
And you're not alone in those sort of challenges too. I mean, when I work in strategy in organisations, we kind of have a sense of 3 to 5 years, but really we're thinking 6, 12, 18 months.
That's right.
Because of this disruption. And what effect does that have? I mean, what things do you think will remain the same as you build your career, and what things do you think will change?
So I think one thing that stayed the same for me has been obviously focus on KPIs. One thing good about being anchored from finance is that we understand KPIs, we understand the P&L, we understand what drives revenue, margins, costs and so on. That's always grounded, and I think I can't walk away from my background in that sense. Whenever there's zany ideas going through my head or someone bounces something off me, my little, I'm doing that sort of calculation in my head. Even I may not share the full results, but I'm thinking through it that way. But it's a universal measure of business. And I think in terms of, I think the other elements of your question, it's more about trying to again challenge. So I think I've got good specialists in my team who know where to go by. Give them the confidence, empower them, and give them some structure, and then show them the reward for where it comes about, and then try to almost foster their own development. So in my team, I've got a head of finance, a head of operations, a head of sales, and a head of marketing. So I often urge them to collaborate with each other, or sometimes the wider group, and to try to work through it with somebody, because at the end of the day, we're all invested and we're all KPI'd about driving the highest EBITDA for the business that we can.
You mentioned something really important there, and I know it's certainly been a focus in my career in the last few years. There's the human, and I run an events business called Humanity in Business.
Okay.
And the key there is the humanity in the business.
Yeah.
And you talk about looking after your team and things like that. Tell me about where this, I want to call it social intelligence, emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Where does that fit within you in your role?
Yeah, it's I couldn't do it without it, and it's something whereby, fortunately, in I think management organisational theory, it's got a lot of prominence of late, which is fantastic, and I don't think it's a fad. I think it's here to stay. Yeah. But I think it's all about. I think obviously, when I went to the Qantas days, we were fortunate to do some leadership events, and I think it was around. Saying that all leaders don't have to be the loudest in the room. They don't have to necessarily, dominate conversations. It's about trying to, bring teams together and trying to work to get common outputs and common goals. And, we can stretch ourselves, we can all celebrate. Yeah. So the one thing I try to focus on is that I think generally everybody comes into work to make a contribution. So I'd often have, like in the new year, for example, a lot of guys were on leave. I'd taken some leave in December, but I was kicking around between Christmas and New Year. So I took some of our frontline younger guys in their early 20s just for coffees and lunches and said, look, what can I do to make your role exciting? Yeah. And it's invariably want to make a contribution, and I want what I do. Their purpose. I want to do something. And, well, guess what? I want to grow this business by 30-40%. We've got a lot to do. Yeah. I'm going to give you the sanctity so you can try things out, and your manager in between is equally devoted and attentive to that. So I said, I'll give them a nudge, we'll work on a few things, and you should just see the faces light up. Yeah. And that's where I think it's really important. All the answers are generally within the business, and we can often nurture those and foster those incentives. And it's really about then trying to move into execution, because everybody has the will. Yeah. It's getting it done is the hardest part. So then it's around trying to frame that where it is. And we've had with my team, had a few management offsites, and we have then focused on, I think we've basically distilled it down to 3 objectives we've done as a team, so myself and my direct reports. And those messages are in our office, and they're effectively things that we are reminded by every day, and they, essentially everything else falls off them in a way of achieving those objectives.
It's as much what an individual does to pursue their goals and what they want in life as it is for your team, kind of thing.
Yeah, you have to find out what motivates people and what drives them in a way. So even with my lead team, I have individuals on my team who like to play it safe, which is very, very important. So often they'll sort of advocate views in that way. And I've got individuals that are really willing to take big risks, but at the end of the day, that risk may be one that sinks the business. So it's one we've got some variety, and we're able to get something and understand different points of view. And that, I think the emotional intelligence, provides a tolerance around those areas, so they don't become, heated conversations, and they become ones in which...
Take that out of it to look at them.
Yeah, to say, look guys, just suspend your judgment here, don't move into solution mode and work through, just throw things out there, and then have the safety net to know that you can talk quite openly about things without fear of either looking silly or stupid and so on. Often we have these very silly ideas that probably come from a young age. Sure. We don't want to look silly or stupid, but I think that stage when you become a bit vulnerable, show that side of it. It allows you to grow with it, and then I think your peers around you will generally be much more accepting of it, and often can urge them to take a similar,
This is humanity business, and having the empathy
Yep.
Reading the play kind of thing.
Yep.
Like, are they annoyed? Are they frustrated? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, so I think to have an effective social structure of that nature is
Yeah.
good for business in that way too. And then you find that when there's things that don't go so well, they're talked about, and there isn't this awkwardness about it in a way. And then it's not immediately moving where people move into, say, covering their position or ask covering, as often you can call it. But just sort of laying it out there, and then the team, says, look, like a family unit does, would work through it and say, look, this is the challenge, and these are the issues around it. And often somebody who's completely unrelated to the issue has the fortunate perspective, not being as invested, and can provide a very good perspective on what is transpiring.
Yeah, that's it. And they're not, emotionally reacting to the situation. They can see through it. Wow. So, thinking back over your career, is there things you would have done differently? What would you have changed in it all?
I think definitely my young days, like you want to climb the corporate ladder, you're chasing job titles, you're after, instant gratification. It's important that, often you're measured by the turnover of the business you work for, how many staff you have, and all those things. And you can get caught up by those things, but it's about trying to get some tangible experiences from it. And what I found is that, getting into this stage, it was those kinds of experiences that have most prepared me for my future. So looking at things like having a mentor or somebody that can guide you, and I think particularly as a younger person, it's tough. And then, also your outside of work experiences, I think, have a lot of bearing on how you operate within the workforce as well. So I think networking, also, getting things like, having married, starting a family, that certainly has an impact. Potentially other interests that you may have, so whether that could be sporting interests or, whether you've got other pastimes that you somehow work through, because equally in those, balance. I think they often can rub off and drive things in. But I think definitely the growth path of being a parent has probably been the most influential, because I think I always wrestle with this, and it was told when I had young children, was you won't find a situation harder in the workplace than one that you've got to solve at home. So you've always knew that. So when you always have a self-belief that everything's fixable, and often work is work, although you take it seriously. Often the other situations can provide a lot more challenge, which in many ways gives you perspective.
Yeah. Your perspective here in the last 40 minutes or so has been really profound, and I hope the community is. I know I'm grateful as well. I didn't see any questions there, so it must have been riveting enough that all the questions were answered. But Ash, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that. Guys, thanks for joining the Outperform webinar. We'll see you again next week, and Brad will be back on board. Signing off. Cheers.